Yeah? Okay. Hello and welcome. On behalf of the Dutch Platform for Renewable Fuels, in this symposium on the future of e-fuels, how to make them the new normal. My name is John Glynn. I'm the independent chairman of the platform, and it's my pleasure to chair this seminar. I will introduce the speakers and the panelists in the order of appearance and as they appear, which basically means that I will now only introduce, for this moment, Erik van de Heuvel. Erik is director of the Platform for Renewable Fuels. He is an engineer in innovation management by training. He holds certificates in strategy, innovation and scenario planning from Oxford University. And he has, most importantly, been working on sustainable energy, especially on renewable fuels, for the past 25 years, or past quarter of a century. Erik, please take the floor.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Moderator. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, here in the room. Welcome also to the people that follow us via the live stream. Indeed, we try to bring the message here to you that it is time that renewable fuels, rather than fossil fuels, are the normal reference situation. So how to make renewable fuels the new normal. And to start with that, I wanted to show this graph to you. This is a graph which is in the Impact Assessment Report by the European Commission, published in 2020, so 2 years ago, on stepping up Europe's 2030 climate ambitions, and where we see that in many other sectors than the mobility sector, there is really progress in the amount of, let's say, renewable energy that is being used in built environment or in the electricity generation sector. This graph shows the brownish areas is the amount of fossil fuels in mobility. And the most left hand, and I'm going to see if I can show that to you. I don't think so. Well, the most left hand one shows you the numbers in 2015, and the 6 bars on the right hand side show you various scenarios, policy scenarios that the Commission actually investigated. And what you do see, if you look very carefully, that at the bottom there are quite some alternatives available, but not in a large quantity that you would say, well, wow, this sector is really going to make a big change in how it will fuel the mobility sector. At the bottom you will see renewable electricity that will kick in, of course. There is a bit of hydrogen in it. There's some e-gases, so e-fuels, but then in the form of gas. Actually, at that time, the European Commission also still had natural gas in that system. I wonder if that still will be predicted for 2030, given the current situation. And the green part are renewable fuels. But oil dominates here. When we take a look at the Netherlands situation, in fact, it is not much different. Again, a bar diagram. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you see in orange or red the CO2 emissions resulting from fossil use in mobility in 1990. And the blue graphs actually show you how over the years, with time blocks of 5 years, it developed up to 2020. And of course, the year 2020, we have experienced, and that was for the first time that we actually had lower emissions in the Dutch transport system, and this is only national territory, so it's only road, rail, and inland shipping, that we were below the 1990 value, but of course we know that this was largely due to the lockdown situation under the COVID circumstances. Then there is a striped bar presenting the recent climate and energy exploration numbers by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency for 2025. And the last group at the right-hand side bars reflect the predictions on existing and announced regulation and policy instruments, what will be the CO2 emissions in 2030. And well, we do see that with the years, actually we achieve a bit of a lower CO2 emission in the transport sector, but still in the blue parts, it is still far above the 25 million ton that was the target as a maximum CO2 emission reduction level. And in the recent coalition agreement and in letters by the government, we said, well, we want to have an increased ambition on the CO2 emission reduction, and it should come to maximum 23.7. Yet, when you take a look where we are, so far we only have established in 2030 then around 12% lower CO2 emissions in 2030 compared to 1990. Imagine 12% in 30 years, well, in 40 years' time. That is still so much depending on fossil fuels here. And actually the ambition by the government would actually mean, well, we have to go even to the double level to go below this 23.7 million. So we should go to minus 24. So after 40 years, we're halfway of what we still have to establish in the next 7 years. So there's a huge challenge. And fossil causes the CO2 emissions in that sector. So we have to move to renewable energy. And renewable energy means renewable electricity and renewable fuels. And of course, smaller vehicles so that we are more efficient. Unnecessary mobility should be eliminated and stuff like that. And model shift to public transport, all of that should be done, but still there needs to be fuels in the system. Mandates, however, do not bring that large amount of renewable fuels or renewable energy in our system. The 4 bars on the left-hand side actually show you the first 3 show you the actual developments over the years of the various renewable fuels and renewable electricity in the system. In 2030, we should really have an established one, an increase. As you can see, it will be larger, but this would only result in a total renewable energy share in the physical terms of perhaps 12 or 13%, meaning that the remaining is still fossil. So we took the assignment from State Secretary Ms. Heijnen, who said, what can we do to actually go beyond and below this 23.7 that you saw in one of the earlier graphs? And this is what we came up with. Actually replace in total about 1/3 of our fossil fuels in our system with renewable fuels, and of course a higher share of renewable electricity, because we expect that there will be around 2 million electric vehicles in the total fleet. But the majority of the fleet will be using liquid fuels that need to be renewable. And that would actually mean that we have to step up and to scale up significantly in the coming years to make this happen. The point is, and the nice point here is that we checked whether these fuels, when they are blended in, fit within the fuel specifications and also fit within the vehicles that are on the market. So it can be done, it should be done, otherwise we will never be below this volume. And you can see, I mean, this is a big step up, and we have to improve our ambitions here. And I will show you how that would actually then look like in our total system. CEF, the Climate and Energy Exploration of last year, I took the older numbers, expects that by 2030 we will have around 460 petajoules of fuel energy used in our national territory. And we think that there will be about 150 petajoules of renewable fuels next to 20 petajoules of renewable electricity in the system, leading to almost 13 million tons CO2 less emissions than when all of that had been sustainable, had been fossil. And of course, you may expect that in the next years that will grow. Renewable electricity will grow largely in it, so we have some years to actually push out fossil. But the Netherlands have another specific circumstance, of course, and that is that we also have a very big international bunkering market. So our shipping sector, the fuels that we bring to our international ships, is equal, if not even a bit larger, than the fuels that we consume on land. And there is now upcoming regulation at EU level, Fuel EU Maritime Regulation, that says, well, we have to lower the CO2 intensity of the energy consumed in ships, and that would mean for the Dutch situation more or less around 36 petajoules. And in the bunkering for aviation sector, which is a smaller sector but still significant to the Dutch total energy consumption, we expect that there will be this obligation by a refuel aviation of 5% in 2030, which would mean around 10 petajoules of fuels in the system. So I think that the green part here is the new normal, which should push out as quickly as possible in all of these segments the liquid fuels that are of fossil origin, and then we'll go side and side with renewable electricity to push out. And then all of these, when renewable electricity then really becomes dominant, when there are sufficient vehicles in the market that are electric and battery electric fueled, then of course these fuels can enter also and can fulfill these volumes in aviation and the maritime sector. We have said that on many occasions again, but I think it is time to repeat it, because if you want something to become seen as normal, you have to frapper toujours, as they say, to repeat and repeat and repeat. Renewable fuels are the near future. So, will it be more expensive? Well, there was an interesting study we executed recently where we had a total cost of ownership for heavy-duty trucks in the Netherlands. This is with data of pre-Russian-Ukraine crisis, by the way, where we actually said, well, are there options to either drop in renewable fuels or have adapted engines that can process renewable fuels, and renewables are then divided in either biofuels or renewable fuels, and we have also some options of hydrogen in there. So what you see is the gray bars are the fossil options, combustion engine types, mainly all diesel, but also some fossil methanol, etc. The blue ones are all the biofuels. The pink ones are e-fuels, and the orange ones are hydrogen. A full bar means, in the colors of blue, for instance, that it is a drop-in biofuel, so it can exist used in an existing vehicle. If the bars are striped, it would mean that it is an adapted engine you would require. And the interesting point is that there are, on the left-hand side, the options with the lowest TCO cost, so all costs over a period of 7 years. And surprisingly to ourselves as well, the fossil diesel option was not most left. There were 3 options with adapted engines, so like DME, bio-CNG, and the diesel and biomethanol option that actually are cheaper. So we have options that are lower or at par to fossil diesel or near par to diesel. We also see that the e-fuels on the right-hand side are still facing higher costs. And that, of course, means that we have to develop these options further to bring down the cost of electricity production, to bring down the cost of electrolyzer production, to bring these fuels slowly to the left side of this bar. But I would say here, again, renewable seems to be a normal here, and at least a majority in this diagram. So, to have 2 more slides, Chairman. I think how to make renewable fuels the new normal. I think we have to change the current mandates for renewable fuels and shift it to actually limit and decrease the volumes of fossil fuels. That will boost innovation in renewable energy, both fuels and electricity and energy efficiency. Mandates actually keep fossil as the reference. 16% in the total fleet, maybe, so that means 84. It means fossil is a reference. We should get rid of that. Mandates also set the pace at which renewables are introduced in the sector, and nobody actually is supplying beyond that mandate limit. So the mandates set the pace, and the pace is not going quick enough for climate measures. And we need a lot of upscaling, and that requires incentives that accelerate that upscaling. So the platform sees that in the Fit for 55 package published last year, there are quite some elements already for a new market mechanism. The emission trading scheme sets actually decreasing and absolute ceilings on the amount of fossil. So this is going to be very helpful, and I think US sector have to adapt to that circumstance. The ETD, the Energy Tax Directive, can shape a better price competitive position for renewables. Very important, of course. And this will then set the need for much higher volumes for renewable liquid and gaseous fuels. And are you, as sector, then ready, also your suppliers and the upstream parties that you connect with, are you ready to make that happen in the coming years? So it will be quite relevant to prepare the market for these higher volumes under the ETS and on the ETD context. And how can we design then perhaps also the new RED III system to facilitate that transition to that new market context. So what is necessary for such a scale-up? That's an open question for me as well. So the question how to make renewables the new normal is a question that I think we as a collective, as a society, need to work hard on. So to finish off,
Yes.
I think according to our platform, we are an independent knowledge and innovation platform, and we think that preparations for the scale-up are very urgent and necessary. Now, imagine how would a post-2030 market function? Will it predominantly indeed become this carbon market like the ETS? And how will renewable fuels that are zero emission on a tank-to-wheel basis, how will they then integrate into that system? How do we keep track of sustainability given the already high administrative burden that we hear that parties face in certification and verification of these fuels? And as platform, together with the blockchain, the Dutch Blockchain Coalition and other sector players, and also with the involvement of the Dutch Emission Authority, we actually explore the use of what we call decentral ledger technologies. A big known technology for that is the blockchain technology. How that can help to prove at much more efficiency sustainability, and not only to the government via the National Emission Authority, but also to end users, because the end users are starting to claim also low carbon performance for their clients as well. So how to make it also a wider scope. So this is one of the key elements that we as platform actually work on at the moment, with a lot of sector players and a lot of involvement of members of the platform. And how do we organize access to sustainable and reliable green carbon sources at scale? Not only for the Dutch market, but also for other EU markets. The Netherlands does have this EU logistical hub position. So we currently work also on developing a kind of a proposal for the National Groeifonds to support the sector in this feedstock supply chains that fulfill at the same time also not this biofuel function or this bioenergy function, but also other societal needs like climate adaptation, nutrient recycling, soil enhancement at agricultural or forestry points, biodiversity, etc., etc., etc.
Thank you very much, Erik van de Heuvel. Our next speaker will appear on screen. He will give his keynote lecture online. So we'll just wait a bit until he appears. Yeah, there he is. We are honored to welcome today Dr. Ilkka Hannula. He is an economist and an engineer by training. He achieved a doctorate in science, technology and energy engineering. And he has been a visiting scholar at prestigious universities like Princeton and Cambridge. He spent 15 years at VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, but currently he is the senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency in Paris. And we are really happy that in that capacity he will present to us the IEA net zero scenario and the role of bioenergy therein. Please take the floor.
Thank you for the introduction and hello from Paris. Sorry that I cannot be there in person today, but I hope you can kind of accept some presentation online. Thank you for the opportunity to give some perspectives to this topic from the IEA. Let me just share my presentation. All right. So I was planning to briefly make a short intervention to talk about how low emission fuels, like we nowadays call them at the IEA, instead of transitioning from low carbon fuels to low emission fuels, how they are featured in our main scenarios, and then bioenergy in general, something about hydrogen, and then going to our biofuel forecast. And really starting by looking at where we are along the road to net zero by 2050, just Going back to pre-Paris Agreement times, this is how the IEA baseline scenario for CO2 emissions looked like. So with constant growth along up until mid-century. However, a lot has changed since the Paris Agreement, and our baseline scenario, which we nowadays call the stated policies scenario, when it comes to CO2 emissions, looks like this. And in the launch of the World Energy Outlook 2022, 3 weeks ago, our executive director, Patti Birol, said that for the first time in IEA baseline scenario, we see a peak fossil fuels before 2030. So this is already just a baseline scenario which aggregates all the clean energy targets implemented by governments around the world, coupled with developments in clean energy technologies, which leads to this kind of emissions trajectory. Then on top of this, we have our announced pledges scenario, which basically takes the stated policies as a starting point and then adds various pledges made by governments around the world, climate pledges, most famously various net zero emissions pledges. Many countries have made, the EU as a whole, the US, China, and in Glasgow last year, even India did a net zero emissions pledge. If those pledges would be fully implemented and kept in full, this is how emissions would look like. And for the first time, there is enough ambition globally that if this would all be implemented, we would be looking about limiting the warming to below 2 degrees. So this is announced pledges is 1.8 degrees of warming. However, this is still far away from reaching net zero emissions by 2050, which is a scenario that is consistent with the ambition to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. And in this net zero emissions scenario by 2050, bioenergy plays a major role. It plays a role in various forms, but especially you can see it when you calculate everything together, because bioenergy contributes to many, many sectors, and looking sectors separately, bioenergy is not at the top in all the sectors, but when you calculate everything together, it plays a major role. From today, bioenergy is used both in IEA categorization. We talk about traditional bioenergy, and then we talk about modern bioenergy. The traditional part mainly involves the collection of fuel wood for cooking purposes in developing countries. This is something that is polluting and unsustainable and is fully phased out in the scenario by the end of this decade and substituted by clean cooking technologies. The modern part here rises 2.5 times from where it is today to meet 100 exajoules in 2050. This then at 2050, bioenergy as a whole meets 20% of global energy needs, becoming the second largest source of energy supply globally, second only to solar. So this is very, very big contributor, and still 100 exajoules as a total demand for bioenergy is well below the assessed sustainable potential of bioenergy. When we look at similar scenarios, IPCC scenarios that also are consistent with the 1.5 degrees, the median bioenergy use in those scenarios is 200 exajoules, and this is 100. Looking more closely how advanced biofuels are featured in this picture, they are necessary for meeting net zero, especially in hard to electrify sectors and applications. Advanced liquid biofuels expand rapidly over this decade, growing from less than 1% of total biofuel supply in 2020 to almost 45% in 2030, and then 90% by 2050. And you can see that they are increasingly used in connection with carbon capture utilization and storage, so CCUS. You can see the shaded part of this graph. And this is the share of production that is associated and connected with CCUS in this scenario. Similarly, looking one slide on hydrogen, how that develops. Hydrogen production is a major business, of course, already today. Some 95 million tons of hydrogen is produced annually from fossil fuels. This production jumps in the scenario sixfold by 2050, driven by low emission sources. So the increase is satisfied from water electrolysis driven by low emission electricity and natural gas with CCUS. In the end, in 2050, 60% of the hydrogen comes from the electrolysis route and about 40% from fossil fuels with CCUS. On the right-hand side, we can see what is the share of hydrogen fuels by sector in 2050. So out of all the sectors, shipping commands the largest shares of hydrogen-based fuels, both ammonia, mostly in large ocean-going vessels, and then hydrogen in more coastal vessels, commanding together a share of around 65%. Then in road transport, hydrogen is about 20% share of fuels, and in aviation in the form of synthetic fuels, so kind of e-kerosene, if you will, they have a share of about 30% of total use. We have just updated our annual publication of tracking clean energy progress 1 month ago. There we compare the current deployment level of around 50 clean energy technologies against where they should be in order to be meeting net zero emission goals. And we assign these kind of traffic lights, and out of these technologies that are all crucial for this scenario, only 2 of them are currently on track with net zero emissions. So electric vehicles and lighting are on track. Then the yellow traffic light means that more efforts are needed to put this technology on track. And then the red light is that they are clearly not on track with net zero emissions. When it comes to bioenergy as a whole, it's kind of given a yellow traffic light. Same for hydrogen supply, whereas biofuels themselves are clearly not on track today globally to meet the net zero emissions targets. Looking more closely into the deployment status of bioenergy, here is the current level of bioenergy use compared to where it would need to be in 2030. The upmost part, the gray part here, is the traditional biomass use. If we kind of take this away, just to highlight the modern part, this is the kind of acceleration we would need to see in the coming 7 years to get on track with 2030. In 2030, 60% of bioenergy supply comes from waste and residues that do not require land use. Going into market, some biofuel market forecasts we publish. In addition to these long-term scenarios, we also publish market forecasts that are 5 years intervals. Unfortunately, I cannot give you the latest data. This is from our previous edition that was published this time last year. The new edition of Renewable Market Report comes out on 6th of December. So maybe to use this opportunity to advertise it a little bit, it will include new analysis, how the current energy crisis impacts our forecast on renewable energy, and also, I think, quite interesting discussion. For the first time, we go into biofuel feedstocks and talking about how we think the feedstock situation will evolve. However, in the current latest published forecast, biofuel demand recovers from the COVID slump and grows by 30 billion liters to 2026. However, it's an uneven recovery, with ethanol demand lagging behind, fully recovering only at 2023. Here on the left-hand side, we have the biofuel demand by region. We notice that the United States is the biggest user of biofuels, followed by Brazil, and then Asia and Europe pretty much equal. Asia, I think, is overtaking Europe in biofuel demand in the forecast in 2024. On the right-hand side, we see the split by fuel. Ethanol is dominating in this figure because it is shown in volume, so in billion liters per year. But because diesel fuels have a higher heating value, I think a 40% higher heating value, if we would show this by energy terms, we would see that biodiesel is now growing, so that the diesel fuels, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and biojet together are now today as big as ethanol itself. Here we have the biofuel demand growth and share by total demand by fuel. On the left-hand side, we have by fuel. So we see that most of the growth globally in biofuels comes from ethanol, followed by renewable diesel. On the right-hand side, we see it by region. So the growth is driven by North America, and secondly by Asia and Latin America, with Europe being significantly smaller share of the growth than these three regions. Out of the growth, ethanol and renewable diesel account about 80% in the forecast. If we look at the biofuel supply and demand growth by region and fuel, at the same time, we notice that in the US, the growth is exclusively in renewable diesel and biojet. In Brazil, it's in ethanol and biodiesel. And in Europe, here in the middle, we see that it's fairly evenly distributed between ethanol, renewable diesel, and biojet. The only thing that is not growing is it's biodiesel, the first generation biodiesel. Again, in Asia, we see more ethanol and biodiesel and smaller amount of renewable diesel and biojet. We have also in the forecast an accelerated case. This is basically taking into account many policy discussions going on. If they would be fully implemented, how it would accelerate the growth. At the time of the launch, there was a lot of policy discussions in the United States, Europe, India, and China, which would almost about double the growth of biofuels in the next 5 years. Largest potential for growth in the accelerated case is in Asia, where they have these policy discussions of a much accelerated deployment of an uptake of biofuels. Just to finish off with a couple of slides of conclusions. So there are many jurisdictions globally that make moves now to include bioenergy and biofuels to having a long-term role in their energy transitions. Over 80 countries globally currently have policies that are supportive of liquid biofuels, especially the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in the US in August this year. It includes extended and new policy support for biofuels, especially for advanced biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF. In Europe, it is a region where the total gasoline and diesel demand is reducing the most. And this has an impact on biofuels because like ethanol and biodiesel that are at blend wall. So when the total amount of fuels used is reduced, then also the when they are at blend wall, also the biofuels role is diminished. The primary drivers of reduced demand in Europe are vehicle efficiency standards, especially for diesel trucks and EV uptake. However, the Fit for 55 package, when it's implemented, this will accelerate biofuels growth also in Europe. But in Europe, we see that the potential for growth is mainly for renewable diesel and biojet, even after the Fit for 55 package. To conclude, to reach the net zero emissions by 2050, it's a very formidable goal, and it requires a complete revolution and transformation in the way we use and produce energy globally. It requires both massive deployment of all clean energy technologies we have in the marketplace today, while at the same time investing in innovation to create new clean energy technologies that can then reduce the emissions in the coming decades when they are commercialized. Sustainable bioenergy features very prominently in the net zero emissions scenario. It provides flexible electricity generation, it provides high temperature heat for industry and fuels for transport, and is increasingly used in connection with carbon capture, utilization and storage. And low emission fuels in the form of sustainable biofuels, hydrogen-based fuels are necessary for reaching net zero, decarbonizing sectors where direct electrification is challenging. All right, thank you for this opportunity and interest. Thank you for your interest.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ilkka Hannula, for a very clear and comprehensive and yet concise talk. Let me just check, given that we do have a few minutes left, whether there is any question or clarification from the audience. Is there anything unclear, or is there anything you would be interested in hearing just a little bit more of information about? Yeah?
Thank you for this.
Marnix?
Maybe you saved it.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Test.
Yeah.
Managed. Thank you for this clear talk. I was wondering about one thing. When you look at new goals and targets for biofuels, there's a big pushback from certain NGOs. Transport and Environment in Brussels is very on topic on this point, even arguing on price, on sustainability. What is your take on it? And do you think this will, stumble the goals and targets for biofuels? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so the discussion is very different in Europe from other places in the world. So when we look at the growth, Europe is quite similar when it comes to growth with the US, where most of the growth comes from renewable diesel and biojet. But the rest of the world, the most significant growth will be in ethanol. And this kind of discussion that we have in the EU is not part of their policy discussion. In one way, you could say that the EU is most advanced when it comes to sustainability and the feedstock requirements. And I think just meeting the targets simply requires more innovation, unlocking new waste-based feedstock sources to be able to supply the biofuels that are kind of comply with the EU regulation. I think those technologies are not in the marketplace, but can be commercialized and the targets can be met. So I don't think the sustainability targets, they cannot be fully met maybe with existing technologies, but clearly with technologies that could be commercialized in Europe.
Thank you. Are there other questions for clarification from the audience? If not, then I do have a question, if I may. We are focusing this symposium specifically on one category of renewable fuels, a category that our platform only recently started to take up, namely e-fuels. So my question to you is, how would you see the role of e-fuels in this package that you have been discussing for meeting the climate goals?
Well, e-fuels, if I understand hydrogen, ammonia, and then synthetic e-fuels like methanol and Fischer-Tropsch from hydrogen and CO2, I think they will have a clear role. But I think in other sectors than aviation, our scenario sees that it will be mostly in the form of hydrogen and ammonia. So hydrogen in road transport, especially in trucks, and then hydrogen in marine transport, mostly for coastal vessels, and then long overseas vessels, carriers would be operating on ammonia. And then aviation would be the main demand for e-fuels that incorporate CO2 or carbonaceous fuels as well. I think they will have a clear role, but when it comes to the carbon-containing e-fuels, if you would like to categorize them in that way, I think it's interesting to see how it will play out with biofuels. I think it will be, of course, a cost issue, but I see also significant benefits because you need a sustainable carbon source for those fuels, and basically it would be either directly captured from air or then taken from byproduct of biomass conversion processes, and how then biomass and biofuels link with the production of these fuels will be interesting to follow.
Okay. Thank you very much again, Dr. Ilkka Hannula. We will now have a panel discussion, and may I just invite the panelists to come forward and each take one of these tables here. Okay, welcome. I will introduce you one by one, and then immediately ask, after introducing one of you, a couple of questions, or maybe one question just on your own focus, on your own work on e-fuels, and then we'll proceed to the next and so on. And after that, we'll have some common discussion. Yeah? So the first panelist I'm happy to introduce is Dr. Svetlana van Bavel. She has been trained as a chemical energy engineer in Eindhoven and also obtained from Eindhoven a PhD as a chemical technologist. She has authored more than 20 academic publications in peer-reviewed international journals, and she has been working nearly 13 years at Shell. And from 2018, she's there the senior process engineer gas to liquids, or EX to liquids, at the Shell Energy Transition Lab. We're really happy that you're here today, Svetlana. Welcome. And my question to you is that you are exploring Fischer-Tropsch technology for power to liquids, biomass to liquids, and waste to liquids. Do you see any differences between these fuels in combustion characteristics?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, and happy to be here. So indeed, I'm working on Fischer-Tropsch technology and how it can be adapted to new renewable, low-carbon, recycled feedstocks to make fuels that will be needed in the energy transition. And we are comparing different pathways. And good thing about Fischer-Tropsch, coming to your question about how different would be fuels that you make from different feedstocks using this technology, is that chemical composition will be identical. So any feedstock can be gasified into what we call synthesis gas, or syngas to make it short, which is mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And sort of once you've cut your feedstock into these building blocks, then it goes into Fischer-Tropsch process to make heavy waxes that you then make fuels out of. And basically, in whichever way you make syngas doesn't matter. So at the end of this technology pathway, you will get the same fuels, and you have high flexibility in what types of fuels you manufacture. You can make kerosene, you can make gas oil, you can also make chemicals, you can make base oils, sort of which are components for making lubricants and many other products.
Okay. Thank you. I have one other question on this topic. Would you say that a more stable, more homogeneous, biogenic feedstock would help to make the combustion characteristics more controllable? E-fuels?
Yeah, I think if we are looking at biomass, there are different things that you can do with it. And so I just described how you can go through syngas pathway. You can also use biomass in other technologies and sort of not break it into these individual small building blocks like carbon monoxide and hydrogen, but keep carbon-carbon bonds intact. And in this way, you will get different composition of fuels than through Fischer-Tropsch. And then, yeah, it will depend on exact composition and also on exact combustion engine that you are using, or how they will compare. Yeah, so you have options. And it depends also on type of biomass, because there's very high difference in different types. Yeah.
Thank you, Svetlana. The second panelist I wish to introduce is Dr. Bart Somers. He is a associate professor at the Technical University in Eindhoven again. He's working in the Power and Flow group, and there is even a group Somers there.
Yes.
He also is a board member of our platform on renewable fuels. And some 2 months ago, the University of Eindhoven had this grand opening of the Zero Emission Laboratory, exploring the road towards zero impact emissions for transport with traditional internal combustion engines running on sustainable fuels.
Exactly.
Again, for you, I do have first a question specifically dedicated to your own specialty. Do you think that the combustion characteristics of e-fuels will be better controllable than those of biofuels?
Yes.
Yes, but could you maybe
No.
elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, it's quite simple. If you look at the long-term e-fuels, that's also mentioned by the previous speaker.
Yeah.
In shipping, they talk about ammonia. Well, ammonia is ammonia. It's just NH3 and that's it. Methanol is a big one. It's also mentioned a lot in shipping, and that's also a single component. So it's very simple. If you get that, you get methanol and that's it. From biofuels, it's also where Svetlana touched upon. It depends on the feedstock. We do have a smaller project with BTG, for instance, where they use pyrolysis as a technique to come up with the first step, and then hydrolyze it, and then you get something like an HVO. We call it HPO because it's hydrolyzed pyrolysis oil. And it has very nice characteristics, but it depends a bit on what kind of feedstock originally is used to produce the pyrolysis oil. So it really depends. But you have to keep it in track. And what we see is that all of these different feedstocks give a good diesel in the end, which can be used as a drop-in quite easily in a conventional engine already.
Okay, thank you. Our third panelist today is Tom Berg. Tom Berg has been trained interdisciplinarily at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and the University of Utrecht. He has experience for 5 years as a consultant in the field of sustainable energy, and he is currently working at SkyNRG, an esteemed member of our platform. And again, may I start with asking you a specific question on your own work, and that is, what do you see as the limiting factor for e-kerosene?
The limiting factor for e-kerosene. I think it depends, right, on how bullish you are on the role of hydrogen and how accessible it is, right? There's always the promise that we will have hydrogen at €1 per kilogram. We see, as a developer of e-kerosene projects, what the difficulties are of achieving that and the hurdles that are still ahead. Electrolyzer capacity manufacturing is lagging behind. We see that also to decarbonize our entire economy, there is a need to decarbonize chemicals. There's a need to turn the black hydrogen that is currently used in fertilizer production and petrochemicals also first into green hydrogen. So there's this huge challenge, and I think we need to be very selective in where we use these pathways, because the conversion efficiencies aren't typically very high, right? There are a lot of losses in going from electricity to hydrogen, and then from hydrogen going to a carbon-based product again. So I think we need to be very careful in looking at, okay, what are the alternatives for every sector? And what we see for aviation is that there's very little alternatives, right? We have advanced biofuels or power to liquids. Those are the flavors that we have. And maybe in the far future, hydrogen cells for aviation. But for road transport, we are blessed to have many more options. And so I think if we look at the role for those products in road transport, I think Hannula already showed that the role for power to liquids or e-products in road transport is fairly limited. But a role I could see there is, for example, where we have a e-kerosene facility. The product slate of such a facility is you can skew it mostly to jet, but you always have a fraction that is diesel or gasoline. And if you look at the mandates that are going to be fulfilled and the sheer amount of co-product you will get out of all of those facilities, that's where I would see sort of a sensible role for e-diesel in road transport in the future, but not a large-scale dedicated facilities purely to make power-to-liquids for that sector, so mainly for aviation.
Okay, well, thank you for making an organic transition to the topic I wish to raise for all of you, namely the relation between e-fuels and the bigger picture, so to say. And you already said a few things about that, but may I ask you one more specific question, Tom? And it's a question that comes from an argument being brought forward by a European NGO called Transport and Environment, known to many of you here in the room. And it has basically claimed that scarce e-fuels would be wasted in trucks. Do you agree or not, and why?
Yeah, so going into my previous, what I said previously, I think I can sort of sympathize with that on a certain level, because it is a bit sort of thermodynamic blasphemy, right? Converting that into an e-diesel. I think the conversion efficiency towards the wheels are in the order of 10-20%. So you would really see that as a last resort option. So first maybe HVO, bio-CNG, and then after that, as a last resort, e-diesel. But as I said, there is a large number of co-product that's coming out of those e-kerosene facilities. So let's use that for trucks, and then see how we can fill the rest. That would be sensible use of that to me. Yeah.
Well, their argument, of course, is about a competition on green hydrogen.
Yeah.
Do you disagree there?
I think there's a large competition on green hydrogen indeed, and we need to be very selective of where we use that. And so trucks, to me, if you look at the hydrogen ladder, come at sort of a 5th, 6th place, and definitely not first.
Okay, thank you. And then Svetlana, do you see advantages for e-fuels? And of course, if so, what are these advantages?
Yeah, I think big discussions about whether you are using biofuels or e-fuels. So big crucial question in the field is how much of sustainable biomass would actually be available. Yeah, and there are different studies out there. So we saw a presentation from IEA. There are other studies as well. And they come sometimes with somewhat different answers. And some say there will be enough biomass, but many say there won't be enough. Yeah, answer can also depend on the region, because to have biogenic feedstock, you have to have arable soil and enough rainfall, yeah, and the right climate. So not in all locations it's feasible. And if indeed it's not for a longer term, for all the needs in fuels that humanity will have, if there will not be enough truly sustainable biomass, then indeed your other alternative is to use renewable power and sort of to convert it into fuels if needed. And I agree with Tom that, yeah, there is a hierarchy in how you use renewable power. So using it as power is the best. So anything that can be electrified should be electrified. And it's about road mobility, it's about industry. Yeah, next step will be hydrogen. And indeed, there are significant losses. So depending on which electrolysis technology you're using, low temperature or high temperature, you're losing 20 to 40% of your renewable energy content. It does not end up in hydrogen. And you get very low-grade heats that actually you can't use usefully, or at least maybe we should become more creative how we can do it, but so far it's just waste. Yeah, and if indeed you convert hydrogen further to hydrocarbons, you have further losses. So indeed it should be a last resort, and you should be looking at applications that are very difficult to decarbonize, that are very difficult to electrify. And aviation is indeed first that jumps to mind. There are many interesting developments for small airplanes, for hydrogen and for batteries, but for long-distance flights, basically battery is a relatively heavy weight, and if you have to lift it to the height of 10 or 11 kilometers, now there's a clear penalty in that. You have less weight of passengers or freight that you can take on board. With hydrogen, it's a different story, because on mass basis, it's relatively high energy content, but then volume, you need relatively large volume of tank on your airplane, which again means you have less space for passengers or for freight. So drop in hydrocarbon fuels that have very high energy density, that's something that aviation industry will need, also for safety reasons, because they are understandably conservative.
Okay, thank you, Svetlana. Before asking precisely the same question to you, yes, if you agree, let me announce that then there will be an opportunity for the audience to interfere in this discussion about the relation between e-fuels and the bigger picture. So, Bart, the same question to you. Do you see advantages of e-fuels compared to biofuels? And again, if so, why? And what advantages?
Well, no, I agree totally with the previous two speakers that you should use e-fuels first where there is hardly any possibility to electrify, and that's air transport for one. Well, the discussion is maybe not so easy in this sense that it's true that if you convert hydrogen into e-fuels, you lose a lot of energy. That's right. But there are also studies by Fraunhofer who say that, okay, there's a power to X atlas, where can you best produce your renewable electricity? And that is typically in regions where you will have a hard time to transport the electricity to somewhere else. So you have to convert it into hydrogen. But then you have the second topic is, okay, how are we going to transport this hydrogen to other parts in the world? Are you do that as hydrogen, or are you going to convert it into other e-fuels like ammonia and methanol, or even further with Fischer-Tropsch towards even heavier liquids? I don't know how big that industry becomes, because, for instance, my solar panels do a much better job in regions where there's a lot of light. So my efficiency to generate solar energy here is much lower than when I do it with the same panels in the Sahara, for instance. So that conversion deficit you mentioned from hydrogen to that becomes completely different if you put your renewable sources somewhere else, create your hydrogen there, and then you have the big problem. What are we going to transport? If you're going to convert that all to methanol, ammonia, or whatever, then the situation might change a bit. But the upside of trucks and alike is that these engines, they eat anything. Whatever you give it, they will burn it with a rather good efficiency. So if there is a shortage of e-fuels and there is an abundance of biofuels, then use them in trucks or in ships, the smaller ships. And for the bigger ones, yeah, you create maybe these ammonia engines or the methanol engines, or and keep the valuable e-fuels if there is a shortage of for airplanes, I would say. But for the long run, I don't know where it goes. If we get a sort of an e-pack, an e-fuel producing and exporting countries, then I don't know what the dynamics will be and how much of things we get.
Thank you, Bart. As announced, there's now an opportunity for anybody in the audience to interfere with this discussion about the position of e-fuels in the energy transition in the mobility sector. You've heard 3 different fuels. They may give rise to comments, critical questions, additional arguments. Yeah, where? Okay.
Bart, how do you see the best way to get us over to renewable fuels? At this moment, you see that the rate of the use of renewable fuels throughout all the industry and mobility is fairly low. We need to speed it up. And how do you see the best way to do that?
Yeah, mandates. I don't know. From what you see currently, and that's it's maybe a bit of a strange situation, is that a lot of OEMs on engines, that's my business, they work on hydrogen engines. Why? Because the EU legislation states that they need to have 30% zero-emission vehicles. What counts as a zero-emission vehicle is only a vehicle that has 0 CO2 in the exhaust, no matter where it comes from. So the only option they have is hydrogen as a fuel in a combustion engine or in a fuel cell. And that sort of hinders what's mentioned before with this study by the Bureau, where you see that the TCO, for instance, for a DME truck or whatever, is pretty low, but there will be no OEM that will develop such a truck, because they don't have any benefit from it. So on that side, I think these EU directives need to change as well, to get a big push from the companies that make engines, basically. But on the other hand, yeah, if they are not forced to do it, if there's no benefit, they will not develop, and then there is no use. For instance, methanol currently you cannot use in a diesel engine. But they can make, if they wish, a very good methanol engine, no problem. But they won't. It has no function for them. So that needs to change, to my opinion, at least on that level. But also, I think we should push the use of bio and advanced fuels from a politician's side.
So basically what you say is that we need to look at the whole picture.
Yes, but everyone is waiting.
We need to look moreover to wheels or waste instead of breaking up that chain and making the wrong decisions.
But I think it's very difficult. It's a life cycle analysis that's really, which is really accounting for everything, and that's what you should do, and everyone does it. And the numbers are easy to understand, but that's not how it works. They say, okay, let's decarbonize or defossilize the electricity market. Let's decarbonize cars just by mandating they should be electric. And then you compartmentalize your problem a bit. And that's maybe handy from a politician's point of view, but it's from the world point of view, it's not the best way. But it's a very complicated picture. You have to attack everything if you, sort of in a coherent way. And that's
Thanks.
maybe too difficult. I don't
I
know.
think there's another question there.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to make a point for the biomass route. First of all, I don't think biofuels are per se different than e-fuels because you can go the synthetic route, so then you have the same molecules. I will send this to Eric. I recently got a report from the World Resources Institute, and that made clear that of the greenhouse gas emissions, about 3.5% comes from crop burning, so residues from crops. 1.6% is from aviation and 1.9% from shipping. So crop burning creates more, I'm not totally right on the numbers, than the total aviation and shipping industry together. So there's a huge urgency to solve this issue and to use these crop residues as feedstock for biofuels. And then we're talking about smart conversion technologies in between. So in our case, we do a torrefaction process and then a gasification process. And I'm surprised to hear this sort of ideas about e-fuels, while we all know that this is a way cheaper solution. We have a way faster, better conversion of carbon. And if you do the economics, because we've also done integrated processes, even if the power is free, and we did that on a free. Sorry. Now the question is, what is your at Shell? What is your look at this? Are you seeing this as a serious option to make serious large volumes of biokerosene, biomethanol from e-fuels, knowing the conversion of hydrogen to CO2 and the electron transfer? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And definitely biofuels are definitely an option in the mix. So none of these options, well, every of these options has its advantages and disadvantages. So indeed, as you mentioned, if you have biogenic feedstock, it's easier to convert it into fuels than CO2 and water with input of electrons. So yeah, it's definitely an option. A lot depends on the region. So okay, you mentioned this 3% of crop being burned. Yeah, that's new to me, and sort of why would you do that? But indeed, any waste streams of biogenic origin is something that you should be using as a feedstock. Absolutely no-brainer. It's easier than doing e-fuels. But in regions where they're not available, e-fuels can also play a role. Yeah, and sort of here you also see difference between European perspective and maybe how Americans are looking into it. In Europe, you see a lot of concern with competition with food production. Yeah, and there are really specified biofeedstocks that are allowed. So famous Annex 9A, for those of you who work in this domain, it just says what is allowed and the rest is not allowed. Yeah, it's not seen as advanced biofuel. So in America's situation may be different because they sort of less concerned about land availability on the rest of it, and they can grow things and sort of use that as feedstock. So yeah, and in some areas nothing grows. So there you may have good solar and wind resource, and then you can use that. So it really depends.
May I just add a couple nuances on the use of those residues? We of course, as SkyNRG, are also looking into using agricultural residues, forestry residues. And I think what makes it difficult is that when you look, for example, at the European availability of all agricultural and forestry residues, you arrive at a number of, let's say, like 600 million tons. It looks huge. But when you then look at how you can convert that into a fuel, right, on an energy or on a mass basis, you have about a 10-20% conversion efficiency. So then there's about 60, 120 million tons left. But there's also, besides transport, other industries like chemicals, petrochemicals, that will need those renewable carbon molecules to make their transition. So when you divide the puzzle, it again seems that it's again becoming a scarcity issue, and even those residues that seem like available at a large scale, are in competition with other sectors. And the final thing I will add is we've also been doing some analysis on the availability on a regional basis, and we see that the concentration of the availability of that residue is also differing a lot across Europe, right? You have certain regions where it's very easy to access a large portion of residues because of the large amount of agricultural area, but that there's also areas where that's more spread over a large area, which makes it more costly to collect that residue. And so I think as we exhaust the potential of those residues, you also see that per unit of energy, that feedstock becomes more and more expensive. And so that's also something we need to take into account, that maybe the first bits will be very cheap, but as we exhaust the potential, it will become more and more expensive.
Okay. Maybe if I can add final remark, yes, sometimes you don't have to choose because there is a synergy in combining biogenic feedstocks with hydrogen feedstocks, yeah, so that's, there's a bridge.
Thank you, that indeed is a bridge. As I just wanted to open a second round of discussion, which is about what e-fuels mean for the three of your core business, so to say. And I could start then, now that we are discussing the source of carbon, with asking you, Tom, to comment upon a recommendation by Transport and Environment again, which basically proposes to use ambient carbon as a source. That means to capture carbon directly from the air as a source for e-kerosene. How do you look into that?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of commenting on T&E's remarks, I'm feeling. But I think this goes back to one of my earlier points, that we need to be very careful about how we use our renewable power. And direct air capture, filtering CO2 from ambient air with 400 parts per million is just going to be very energy intensive. And I think as long as there is 100 million ton of biogenic CO2 available today in the European Union and growing, right, as we expand our biofuels industry, potentially up onto like 300 million tons, if we include, for example, targets to increase biomethane production and conversions of ethanol into fuel, its availability can grow as well. And maybe we can also even look on a case-by-case basis into where it makes sense to even use fossil CO2. I think eventually in 2050 we want to be in a net zero world, right, where there's no net additions of CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. But within that time frame, you can also look, okay, where if I can avoid a lock-in of that industry into sending your CO2 away, look at using that in an efficient way. So that's more the area that we are exploring right now. Of course, you need to start piloting with direct air capture because after 2050, we want to be storing everything. But I think for the near term, we should be looking at those biogenic CO2 emissions.
Okay. Thank you. The next question I want to ask is to Bart Somers. You chaired a working group of our platform conducting an analysis comparing different renewable fuel options and engines for 40-ton trucks on basis of total cost of ownership. How did the e-fuels compare with biofuels?
Where's the graph? I thought the e-fuels were really on the expensive side. That's what I remember. Is that correct, Luis?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is indeed correct.
Yeah, but of course that is the current situation, I guess, because they are very expensive. If you create it, there's a lot of energy loss in the whole chain to create, for instance, from electricity and carbon to methanol, or that's 60% or so efficient, I believe. And that makes an e-fuel fairly expensive to make, and that's the biggest downside. The upside is that if you create a market now for biomethanol or bioethanol or bio something, you can make the same molecules in the far future with renewable electricity. So then you have made your infrastructure, you have made your engines, and in due time you can fade out the fossil part, and you can fade out or extend the share of e-fuels when they come available at a reasonable price. And you don't need to change your technology in your truck. It's the same engine. And that could be the upside of using e-fuels, of studying them, because in the end, if it's a molecule, it doesn't matter how you make it. That holds for hydrogen, methanol, ethanol, DME, OMEs. They're all just molecules. So no matter how you make them, if it works in your application, it will also work if it's in the end an e-fuel instead of a bio or a fossil variant of it.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Bart. And then my question to you, Svetlana, is how interesting it might be for a company like Shell to combine the fuel pathways to e-fuels and to biofuels. So from a process integration perspective, do you see opportunities for doing so?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are synergies between combining these different feedstocks, and it has to do with nature of biomass feedstock. So if you want to make hydrocarbons out of it, it just does not have the right ratio of hydrogen to carbon. You are short on hydrogen to fully utilize it. So you have different options how to deal with it. You can do it only with biomass, or you can do it with biomass with hydrogen. So doing it with only biomass means you are utilizing energy content of biomass. And as a result, you have emissions of CO2. It's just nature of the feedstock. And you could argue that, okay, it's biogenic CO2, it was in the air, was captured in biomass, and now some of it gets emitted. But of course, it does not feel entirely right because it's all about CO2 and its impact on the climate. Yeah, so ideally, you would like to minimize the CO2 emissions as much as possible, and there and that's why if you add hydrogen, you will reduce substantially the CO2 emissions, or even eliminate them altogether, and have higher production of your now combined biogenic and electric or power to liquids fuels. Yeah, so it has advantages.
Okay, thank you. We have now heard three different views from three different firms or fields of expertise on this question how e-fuels might fit in, so to say. What does this mean for your business here in the room, for your field of expertise? What could you add to what already has been said about e-fuels from your perspective? Yeah, Marnix?
Thank you. Well, there are other ways to deploy e-fuel, the hydrogen within e-fuels. I know Tom knows for if you make a HEFA, you have to use a lot of hydrogen to get the bio stock available, suited for your airplane. And this is also something which is happening in conventional fuels. So at this moment, we are largely, my members are, I work from Mobin, and among others, we have got conventional refineries in our memberships. And what we are at this moment pointing at is to replace what is called the gray hydrogen. I heard you call it the black hydrogen. Which color you prefer? The hydrogen which is used in an SMR, which is consequently used to desulfur the diesel, we want to make this green. And this can be done within, it's already been said, the RED II, a scheme from the European Union. And this is our first movement to make hydrogen compatible within the fuel. So we are replacing the gray molecules by green molecules. And that is not an RFMBO for end users, but it's an intermediate stream, intermediate use.
Okay. Thank you. Who else?
Can I just respond to that? Yeah. I'm hearing some concerns from people, mainly NGOs, that when you start doing that right, putting an electrolyzer in a refinery, you're basically sort of extending the lifetime of refineries. So one of my first thoughts was, okay, if you have an electrolyzer and the economy transitions away from the use of fossil fuels, you can sort of repurpose that electrolyzer to do anything else, right? But I'm curious to hear your views on that and the risk of locking in fossil assets over the longer term.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we have a lot of concerns from NGOs from where I work. Yes, what you're saying is essentially right. You can deploy the electrolyzer for any end user you want. And so we always said, to get this economy defossilized, you have to start by changing the market. When end users don't want the product anymore, you will see a change going on upstream until people will not look for oil and gas anymore, for there is no use or ask for it anymore. So that's why we we support the influx of electric cars and are not too much advocating on the part Bart just mentioned. Get other drivetrains in the place. For EV at this moment is your major point. So yes, you're right. You can deploy the electrolyzer for something else, and I just wanted to give some extra arguments.
I will next give an opportunity to each of the three panelists, and inviting them to give a quick remark on anything they wish to bring to the floor at the end of this discussion, a 2 or 3 liner, and then Erik will close the discussion. But before doing all that, is there anyone else in the audience who wishes from his own perspective to comment on what has been said in this round? You? Erik, yourself.
Because if I have to summarize...
Not yet.
But I wanted to... my question is indeed to the three panelists, is that how do you see the competition for hydrogen in the sector of mobility? We have discussed the various segments, road, shipping, and aviation, but industry is also demanding for hydrogen. The built environment requires hydrogen, and let's say the current grey hydrogen in the Netherlands, 1.5 million tons, also needs to be greened. So how strong is the position of the mobility sector to attract the hydrogen to the sector to produce renewable fuels or to use it directly?
Okay. 3 quick answers to that question, then 2 or 3 liners, and then the floor to Erik finally. Bart.
I really don't know. I think we have to see how this pans out in the end. How much hydrogen do we have? Where do we get it from? And how are we going to deploy it? There is a competition between all of these markets because they all have to greenify, or how do you say that? So I don't know what it will be, but what you see is that there are all kind of developments using green hydrogen to produce something for their own use. In my case, that is HPO or methanol or whatever to use in an engine. And if you don't use green hydrogen, it makes no sense at all to make such a molecule. So it's even worse, I would say.
Svetlana?
Yeah, I would welcome competition. So there's just, and I think there is a role for renewable hydrogen. There is also a role for low carbon blue hydrogen. Yeah, so it can be a very good transition fuel.
Okay, and Tom?
Yeah, I think sort of this hydrogen ladder and hydrogen hierarchy thinking is becoming more and more evident, right? And I think we should integrate that into policy making as well. If I see the advertisements of like using hydrogen in homes, I'm like, what are we doing, right? It's just there are perfect alternatives for that. Let's just really use it in the sectors that we have an alternative. We don't have any alternatives, which can be steel making, fertilizer production, hydro treating, and aviation and maritime. Those would be, I think, for me, the priority. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And now for your 2 and 3 liners, Bart.
Well, this pertains to the discussion mostly in my field. There is no silver bullet. So we need to invest in all pathways that we foresee, and we should start as soon as possible. That is what we, and continue to work hard on that, even though that might not be fully supported by legislation or politicians or whatever.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I think for me, the topic that is on my mind a lot lately is, hydrogen is cheapest produced in the regions where it blows really hard and the sun is shining. And so these are typically not in Northwestern Europe. So if you want to produce it in the cheapest way, you're doing that in Chile or Australia. But if we want to have some of our own production, how much are we willing to pay extra for that, given the recent geopolitical tensions, right? Do we want to import 100% of our power-to-liquid fuels from Australia or from Algeria? I'm not sure if that's wise politically, and I think that should be a topic that we should be discussing over the coming months or years.
Thank you very much. And let us then
No.
And then let us then end where we started. I was about to say with Svetlana.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to make the following 2 points. Say, cooperations are important, because energy transition is a formidable challenge, and it's about cooperation between industry and governments and academia coming with brilliant ideas, and also role of ourselves as consumers. Yeah, so all of them are important, because it's really a large challenge that we are facing. And second one is that the role of regulation specifically is indeed key. It was mentioned by many speakers in many presentations. Yeah, and sort of what happens in Europe now with the Renewable Energy Directive, yeah, is definitely something that will shape how the future will look like and how quickly we'll get to the targets.
Okay. Thank you very much, and let me thank all of you, Bart Somers, Svetlana van Bavel, Tom Berg, for participating in the panel. And then I will literally give the floor to Erik, who will round off this discussion.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, John. That is not an easy task to do, because a lot has been said. And I think there are several elements to e-fuels as part of renewable fuels. Technically spoken, actually you indicate here that e-fuels are, let's say, a nice product. The technology is there to produce them. So the different components to make it, and they then are very controllable in their chemical composition. So you actually have a very high quality of fuel that is then available, and I think that is a very strong point for it. Speaking from the environment, I think both, let's say, e-fuels and biofuels have the potential to reduce the use of fossil fuels, so that makes them, in that respect, very important in our quest to actually stop climate change and limit our temperature rise to hopefully this 1.5, and afterwards bring it back to the new normal or the old normal that it was. Economically, there is a challenge because we have seen in the graph that I presented already, e-fuels depend on, at the moment, at high cost of electricity production and high cost of electrolyzer production. So that means there is work to be done. And biofuels, if the wastes are available at lower cost, the technology might be easier to actually convert it into a fuel that can be used to certain levels of blending into the fuel blends. And e-fuels will have to actually bring down their costs to it to actually, let's say, bring them at scale. And bringing them at scale, both the biofuels and the e-fuels do have challenges as well, because there is one big problem with fossil fuels, is that it is so relatively easy to get it supplied. There is abundance of that. And e-fuels you have to make. Biofuels you have to make. It needs processes, and it needs rather a conversion from a centralized supply of a feedstock that we don't want anymore because of all these reasons we have discussed, to feedstocks that are decentrally available. So all the players in this sector who always knew, well, I can always buy my fossil and I can just deliver my demand market, now have to switch and actually start searching for the e-fuels and the biofuels that they need. So the focus of the industry swaps to, well, how can I secure my supply of these kind of technologies that depend on how much renewable electricity capacity will be available, how can I get access to my feedstocks that then at the same time perhaps bring other benefits as well. So that is the challenge, I think, where we have to work on in collaboration. I think there was a strong point made. So in upscaling, we need to also look differently into this sector. And I think it's up to you all here to see how that fits in your business models, in your business cases, and where you do see the innovation opportunities. The market dynamics and the geopolitical dimensions will change. So that power perhaps will be more dispersed, more spread. That might give some social benefits, because the countries, as somebody said, where the wind blows well and the sun shines hard as well, might be new suppliers of renewable sources, which might have better economic positions than they ever had before, but the balance will be different. So lots of opportunities I would like to end up with in a world where we see the need to actually find these opportunities to actually get rid of fossil and make truly renewable fuels the new normal. John.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you all for attending this discussion. And a special thanks to Ilkka Hannula, if he's still listening to us, to Erik, to Bart, to Svetlana, and to Tom again. Please give them a hand.
And a hand for John as moderator.
And please take some time to enjoy each other, to continue this discussion, and maybe to prepare the algemene ledenvergadering of the platform, which is about to take place in half an hour from now. And I'm really urging you to start moving back 5 minutes to 2, so that we're really in our seats at 2 sharp, because we have a lot to do. See you then, and enjoy the time in the meanwhile.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
So, that was